Well, hello there, my sleepy friends. Tonight, we're going to drift slowly through one of the quietest and most surprisingly dramatic stories in economic history. It's the story of the gold standard in the United States. Not just what it was, but how it worked, why people trusted it, why governments struggled to keep it, and why eventually the country moved away from it. So settle in, dim the lights, take a slow breath in, and let's wander back through old mints, dusty ledgers, heavy coins, war finance, train lines, bank vaults, and a summer evening in 1971 when the final link between the US dollar and gold was cut. Imagine, for a moment, a world where money is not just paper and numbers on a screen. A world where a dollar is tied in some formal way to a physical thing, something dug from the earth, something heavy, finite, and glittering, gold. For many people, the gold standard sounds simple. The phrase brings to mind a kind of old-fashioned certainty, a stronger money, a steadier world, a time when a government couldn't simply create more currency whenever it wanted. But the real history is softer around the edges than that, more complicated, more human. And in the United States, it did not begin with a neat golden rule from the very start. In fact, the early American monetary system was not originally a pure gold standard at all. The country began with a bimetallic system, meaning the dollar was defined in relation to both silver and gold under the Coinage Act of 1792. For much of the early republic, the practical standard shifted depending on market conditions, and for long stretches, silver functioned more prominently than gold. That's an important place to begin, because if we want to understand why the United States left the gold standard, we first have to understand that it took a long time to fully arrive there. In the beginning, the young United States was trying to build trust in its government, trust in its laws, trust in its money. The founders knew that money mattered, not just as a tool of trade, but as a symbol of stability. A nation that wanted to be taken seriously needed a monetary system people could understand and believe in. So in 1792, Congress created the U.S. Mint and established the dollar as a unit tied to precious metal. But this was not yet the clean, single metal, gold standard many people imagine. It was a world of both gold and silver. Coins mattered deeply. Metal content mattered deeply, and the ratio between gold and silver mattered too, because if the legal ratio set by the government didn't match the market ratio, one metal would tend to vanish from circulation while the other stayed. This was one of the quiet problems with bimetallism. It could look stable on paper while behaving unpredictably in real life. And so, early American money was already shaped by a recurring tension that would define the next 2 centuries. Should money be constrained by metal, or should it be flexible enough to meet the needs of a growing economy? That question never really went away. It only changed form. As the 19th century unfolded, the United States expanded westward, industrialized, fought over banks and central authority, and experienced repeated financial panics. Money was never just money. It was politics. It was class conflict. It was regional conflict. It was the difference between debtors and creditors, farmers and bankers, exporters and wage earners. Gold carried a reputation for discipline. Silver had its own powerful political supporters. Paper money could be useful, but also frightening. And beneath all of that sat a basic concern. If money could be created too easily, could it still be trusted? During the Civil War, that concern became impossible to avoid. The federal government, facing enormous wartime costs, issued greenbacks, paper money not fully redeemable in gold. This was a major departure from specie convertibility, and from the Civil War until 1879, fiat-style greenback money predominated nationally, even while some states remained closer to gold usage. War has a way of changing monetary rules. When survival is at stake, governments often choose flexibility over discipline, and that pattern would repeat again later. But after the Civil War, the U.S. gradually moved back toward redeemability and then more firmly into gold. By the 1870s, many countries were embracing gold monometallism, and the United States followed that broader trend. George Selgin's History for Cato notes that Germany's move toward gold helped prompt the United States to demonetize silver and enter the era of the classical gold standard. By 1879, the United States resumed specie payments, and the late 19th century became the great age of the classical gold standard. Now let's slow down here, because this is the heart of the story. What actually was the classical gold standard? In simple terms, it was a system in which the dollar was defined by a fixed amount of gold, and paper currency could, directly or indirectly, be converted into gold at that official rate. Gold was not just an investment or a shiny reserve asset in a vault somewhere. It was the anchor, the standard, the thing that gave the monetary unit its formal definition. Under a genuine gold standard, the basic unit is a specific weight of gold, and other exchange media are expected to be convertible into it. That sounds clean and solid, and in some ways it was. It imposed limits. A government could not, at least not easily, create unlimited money without risking a drain on its gold reserves. That limitation was exactly what many supporters admired. To them, gold restrained political temptation. It discouraged reckless issuance. It protected long-term confidence. And in the late 19th century, it fit neatly with a world increasingly linked by trade, capital flows, shipping routes, telegraphs, and international finance. When major countries shared a gold-based framework, exchange rates were more predictable. Merchants liked predictability. Bankers liked predictability. Investors liked predictability. The gold standard seemed to promise order, but order always has a cost. One cost was rigidity. A gold standard can help anchor expectations, but it also ties the money supply to gold reserves and to the broader behavior of banking systems that must maintain convertibility. That can become painful during crises. If confidence weakens and people rush to convert paper into gold, banks and governments can come under severe pressure. And if gold flows out of a country, policymakers may respond by tightening credit, raising interest rates, or tolerating recession in order to defend convertibility. This is one reason the gold standard has always inspired both admiration and frustration. It offered discipline, yes, but discipline does not always feel gentle, especially during hard times. In the United States, the late 19th century gold standard coexisted with recurring political battles over money. The most famous involved silver. You may remember the phrase "cross of gold" from William Jennings Bryan's 1896 speech, where he argued against forcing ordinary people onto what he saw as an unforgiving, gold-based monetary system. That conflict was about more than metal. It was about who got relief and who absorbed pain. Creditors often preferred harder money. Debtors often wanted more monetary flexibility. The gold standard was never just a technical system. It was a social choice with winners and losers. Still, the US remained on gold, and in 1900, the Gold Standard Act formally affirmed gold as the monetary standard. For a while, the system endured. Then came the 20th century, with its industrial wars and mass democracies in much larger states, and that world put strains on gold that the 19th century had only hinted at. The first great break came with World War I. The classical gold standard era lasted until around World War I, when countries commonly suspended convertibility during wartime. This makes intuitive sense. War is expensive. A modern war, especially, is astonishingly expensive. Governments need to pay soldiers, buy weapons, build ships, move supplies, support allies, and do all of this faster than taxation alone can usually manage. A strict gold standard gets in the way. It says, in effect, you may spend, but only within constraints. And wartime governments rarely like constraints. So in many countries, gold convertibility was suspended or weakened. The old classical system did not survive the war intact. After the war, people did try to rebuild an international gold-based order, but it was not the same thing as before. What emerged was the gold exchange standard, a more fragile arrangement that depended more on central bank cooperation and reserve currencies. This mattered because the interwar world was not calm. It was scarred. Debts were high, politics were unstable, economies were imbalanced, and governments were now expected to manage unemployment and social strain in ways 19th century governments often were not. That made a rigid monetary anchor harder to maintain. Then came the Great Depression, and here the story becomes even more dramatic. Though we'll keep our lantern light low and move through it gently. Bank failures, falling prices, collapsing demand, unemployment, fear. Under those conditions, a gold commitment could become a trap. Countries that clung too tightly to gold often found it harder to respond aggressively to crisis. In the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt took major steps in the 1930s that transformed the domestic role of gold. Americans were restricted from holding monetary gold, and the dollar's gold value was changed. The old relationship between everyday domestic money and gold became much weaker, even though gold still mattered internationally. So by the time people speak of the gold standard later in the 20th century, they are no longer talking about the same kind of world that existed in, say, 1880 or 1900. The form had changed. The meaning had changed. The system was evolving into something narrower and more state-managed. Then came World War II, and after it, the architects of the post-war order gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944. Representatives of 44 nations met there to design a new monetary framework for the world economy. This system, known as Bretton Woods, is sometimes described casually as a return to gold, but it was really something more layered than that. Under Bretton Woods, other major currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. So gold was still there, but now it sat behind the dollar in a special international role. This was not a system where ordinary Americans routinely walked into a bank and casually exchanged paper bills for gold coins. It was a system centered on governments, central banks, official reserves, and the dollar's role at the center of global finance. Why the dollar? Because the United States emerged from World War II in an unusually strong position. Its industrial base was intact. Its economy was enormous, and it held a very large share of the world's monetary gold. Some estimates place U.S. holdings at roughly 2/3 of the world's monetary gold by the end of World War II. That gave the United States a kind of monetary gravity, and for a time, Bretton Woods worked reasonably well. The system helped support post-war recovery, trade, and exchange rate stability. But stability in international finance often rests on hidden tensions, and Bretton Woods had a very important one. For the world to have enough reserves and liquidity, the United States needed to supply dollars to the rest of the world. But the more dollars it supplied, the more foreign holders could begin to wonder whether those dollars were really supported by enough gold. That tension later became famous as the Triffin dilemma. Even if you don't use the term, the logic is easy to grasp. If the dollar is the world's reserve currency, the world wants dollars. If the world keeps accumulating dollars, U.S. obligations grow. If those obligations grow faster than U.S. gold reserves, confidence starts to fray. And once confidence frays, convertibility becomes dangerous, because then everyone has an incentive to redeem sooner rather than later. A quiet system can turn suddenly into a rush for the exits. By the 1950s and 1960s, the United States was facing exactly this kind of strain. It was spending heavily abroad, running deficits, financing Cold War commitments, and over time, more dollars accumulated outside the United States than could comfortably be reconciled with America's gold stock at the official price. As the Library of Congress summary of Bretton Woods notes, the system eventually collapsed because of growing pressure on U.S. gold reserves as foreign governments held increasing amounts of dollars relative to the American gold supply. Some countries became skeptical. France, most famously, was increasingly unwilling to treat dollar promises as good enough forever. Foreign central banks could still exchange dollars for U.S. gold under the Bretton Woods framework, and they did. The pressure mounted. The United States lost substantial gold reserves over these years. The problem was not that gold itself had disappeared from the earth. The problem was that the commitment to redeem dollars for gold at a fixed official price was becoming harder and harder to defend. This is an important distinction. People often say the gold standard failed, or, from the opposite camp, the government abandoned sound money. Both statements contain some truth, but each can oversimplify. What was really failing was a particular political and international arrangement, a promise to maintain a certain convertibility under conditions that had changed. The post-war world economy had grown. Dollar claims had grown. U.S. policy priorities had changed, and the arithmetic became harder to ignore. Now we arrive at the quiet climax of the story. August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and announced the suspension of dollar convertibility into gold. The Federal Reserve's historical summary describes this as the closing of the gold window, ending the ability of foreign governments to convert dollars into U.S. gold at the official rate. It was described as temporary. It was not temporary. And this is the moment most people have in mind when they say the United States left the gold standard. Strictly speaking, or what ended then, was the final international convertibility link from Bretton Woods. The older domestic gold standard had already been transformed decades earlier, but 1971 was the final break in the chain. After that, the dollar became a fiat currency in the modern sense, no longer redeemable in gold on official demand. Its value would rest not on a fixed metal definition, but on state authority, monetary policy, taxation power, legal institutions, market confidence, and the broader productive capacity of the U.S. economy. A different kind of trust, less metallic, more institutional, more psychological, more political. Why did the shift happen? At the deepest level, because the goals of a modern state had outgrown the limits of the gold link it was trying to maintain. That doesn't mean gold had no advantages. It did. It imposed discipline. It constrained discretion. It could anchor long-run expectations. But it also restricted policy flexibility at moments when governments increasingly wanted room to maneuver. During war, depression, banking panic, or international imbalance, that room could seem indispensable. And by the mid-20th century, the United States was not just a country managing its own domestic currency. It was the issuer of the world's central reserve currency. That role created pressures the classical gold standard had never fully resolved. So the shift away from gold happened in stages. First, the early United States was bimetallic, not purely gold-based. Then the country moved into a more formal classical gold standard in the late 19th century. World War I disrupted the classical model. The interwar years weakened it further. The 1930s transformed gold's domestic role. Bretton Woods restored a more limited international gold link through the dollar at $35 an ounce, and 1971 ended even that final convertibility. That long transition is the real story, not a single switch flipped in one moment, but a slow retreat from metal-based constraint toward managed fiat money. Now, in the quiet after the history, it's worth asking what people are really debating when they argue about the gold standard today. Usually, they are not only debating gold, they are debating trust. Should trust in money be rooted in something physically scarce, or in institutions, in a metal, or in governance, in automatic rules, or in expert discretion? The gold standard appeals to people who worry, sometimes reasonably, that governments and central banks will abuse monetary freedom. Fiat money appeals to people who worry, also reasonably, that a rigid monetary system can worsen crises and force unnecessary pain. This is why the argument never fully dies. It's not just about economics. It's about what kind of constraint we believe human beings need. A gold standard says, limit yourselves in advance. A fiat system says, preserve room to respond. History offers examples that flatter both sides and embarrass both sides. Gold could stabilize, but it could also squeeze. Fiat currency can adapt, but it can also inflate. There is no monetary system made of pure virtue, only trade-offs and changing political choices. So, if you imagine the whole story as a long nighttime landscape, it might look something like this. At first, a young country sorting silver and gold into law. Then a broad 19th century road lit by the hard, steady glow of gold convertibility. Then distant thunder, war, suspension, reconstruction, depression, a redesigned world order in a hotel in New Hampshire, a dollar elevated above others, still tied to gold, but more delicately than before. Then mounting pressure in overseas claims and central bank ledgers. And finally, a president at a desk on television telling the world that the old promise would no longer be kept. Not loudly, not with a crash of coins, just with an announcement. And after that, we entered the monetary world we still live in now. A world of fiat money, floating currencies, central banks steering by interest rates, expectations, and credibility rather than redemption into metal. A world less tangible than the old one, but in its own way, no less dependent on belief, because all money, in the end, depends on a shared story. Gold tells one kind of story, paper tells another, digital balances tell yet another. But beneath them all is the same quiet question. Why do people accept this in exchange for real things? And the answer is always some mix of habit, law, confidence, memory, and power. As we close, picture an old gold coin resting in a dark velvet tray, its edges worn smooth, its face stamped by a government long gone. Once, it might have represented certainty, or discipline, or prestige, or restraint. Now it represents history, a reminder that money is never just a neutral tool. It is a mirror of what a society fears, what it values, and what promises it believes can still be kept. And the history of the gold standard in the United States is really the history of those promises changing over time, from bimetallic beginnings to classical gold discipline, to wartime suspension, to Bretton Woods Compromise, to the final closing of the gold window in 1971. A long, quiet shift, not from reality into illusion, not from strength into weakness, not from virtue into vice, just from one set of trade-offs to another. And like so much of history, it happened gradually, then suddenly, and then it became normal. The world people once thought of as permanent became old-fashioned. The new world, at first unsettling, became ordinary. And tonight, from a distance, it all looks very still. Gold in vaults, paper in wallets, numbers in ledgers, promises passing from hand to hand, and sleep at last, settling over the whole long story.